It says in chapter 9 of verse 14 that when they came down, that's Peter, James and John came down with Jesus from the mountain, he came to the remainder of his disciples, and what he saw was that a great crowd of people surrounded the disciples, and even the scribes, who, as you know, were part of the religious hierarchy of the day, were questioning the disciples. So at that point, it wasn't clear what the problem was, only that here were the disciples, Jesus wasn't with them, and when he came back, he found that the remaining 9 were being questioned by the scribes and by the people. So in verse 16, Jesus asks the scribes, "What question are you asking? What's wrong?" And it wasn't one of the scribes, but one of the crowd who answered. And he said, "Master, I have brought my son here, which has a dumb spirit, and this evil spirit takes him, tears him, throws him into the fire and into the water," and so on, and describes the terrible things happening to the boy. And then in verse 18, he says something. He says, "I spoke to your disciples that they should cast out this evil spirit, and they could not." So now you have a very clear example, and this is the only time I actually see this quite clearly outlined in Scripture. This man with the father with this son who's in such great difficulty, he's dumb and he has this evil spirit. And he is now coming to Jesus with an element of doubt. Because he says, "I brought my boy to your disciples, they couldn't heal him." So immediately, you've got this sense of questioning and of doubt. And I find that even today, I think we've got to take notice of this, because there is, to a large extent, an element of doubt and questioning over so much of our Christian experience. The unbelievers don't understand. We're criticized. We're regarded, all Christians are now regarded as a strange sect. And so you've got this question. And what was the immediate response of Jesus? Now, from Mark's Gospel, Jesus in verse 19 answers this man, the father, and says to him, "Faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long will I suffer you? Bring him to me." Now, I had originally assumed from reading this that the question was partly thrown at the disciples. But in actual fact, here it wasn't. Because in verse 19, verse 18 and 19, Jesus is dealing with the boy's father. And when the father has the doubt, because the disciples couldn't heal him, Jesus answers the father straight down the line and says, "You are part of a faithless generation. How long am I going to be here? How long will I put up with this? Bring the boy here." Now, I find this quite strong and quite interesting to me as an evangelist, that we're dealing here with a very clear case of unbelief by the faithless representative of the generation, but the disciples who couldn't counter it by doing what we already know they were commanded to do, which was to heal the sick. And then, of course, Jesus takes up the question. And when they brought the boy, of course, the Spirit took control and threw him on the ground and so on. So verse 21, Jesus asks the boy's father, how long has this happened? And the answer is, since he was a child. And then he begins to describe some of the symptoms. So what is the answer of Jesus? The question is now not with the disciples. We know that they couldn't do it. The whole question is, the Father now doubts and even casts doubt at Jesus. In fact, he's really at this point questioning what's going to happen. And that's why, by the time you get to verse 23, Jesus says, not to the disciples, but he's saying to the Father, if you can believe, all things are possible to him that believes. Now, I find that this is a fascinating and a remarkable way that Jesus is speaking. I believe that it's quite honestly, it's a challenge to the church. It was a challenge to the other 9 disciples as well, a challenge to all of the disciples. But the challenge was to an unbeliever, an unbelieving father who'd seen the failure of the disciples. And yet Jesus said to him, if you can believe, everything. Now, I find this a tremendous statement. It's all-encompassing. All things are possible to him who will believe.